Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
In this episode of the Disrupt Your Career podcast, we're welcoming the wonderful Michael Wenderoth. He's calling in from Spain. He's warned us that we might have a Wi-Fi outage or two. So if there's anything that feels a bit cranky in this recording once we get there, then please just forgive rural Spanish conditions. They're a pretty exciting place to live, but not always easy in connection terms. Michael is someone who's on a mission to help talented people ascend beyond their expectations. He does this through his teaching at Stanford and IE Business Schools, through executive coaching, writing, and speaking. He's got an amazingly fascinating cultural background and multiple degrees from across the globe. Michael, welcome.
Claire, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start, as we always do, with your career journey. You've been through numerous pivots and challenges in your career, including working in marketing, consulting, project and product management across the globe, before beginning your academic advisory and coaching activities. You've done this literally across the globe. Why don't you tell us about how your career unfolded, talk about whether it was through design or serendipity, and talk us through some of your key moments of pride and achievements and challenges.
Design versus serendipity, I say, might be a bit of a false dichotomy. I prefer to think of it as a combination of both, and I'd maybe use slightly different words: being very intentional, being persistent, and benefiting. I think it's the number one thing people tend to underplay: luck. So luck playing a part as well. Because actually, if I look back, and I think this was a great question that you let me know was coming in advance, was that I certainly didn't make my career moves saying I exactly wanted to be marketer, trainer, consultant the next years in healthcare or tech, or now as a coach, be in China, Silicon Valley, all of those things. In fact, when I looked back on it, almost all the jobs that I held or eventually took didn't actually exist at the time. And I think that's the way the world's moving. There's constant innovation and change. So I'll just say a couple things about these parts about being intentional, persistent, and luck. And I believe in that saying, and maybe this is my American roots coming through, that the more you focus and persist, the luckier you get. And so by being intentional, I just mean a couple things here. And this, I think, goes to the part around shifting your career or disrupting it, is I was always exploring areas that I was interested in. And those would be kind of through either direct outreach, kind of exploration, networking, or like taking on small projects, like kind of exploring things that would also get my foot in the door or give me some credibility in those areas. And I think the flip side of this is not pursuing areas that would be kind of easy, because I think it's sucked into what's the fad at the time, of whatever kind of period I was in, or what other people saw in my resume, because they're always trying to fill a spot with someone who's already done that. And so I was always interested in some of those changes. And maybe we'll talk about it later, but as I moved into new areas, again, hindsight's 2020, but I did a lot of what I call like working the adjacents. And by that, I mean that looking at areas that would be somehow connected to what I was doing, but kind of a new area that would kind of move me forward. And then learning how to, because sometimes other people don't see that, like the hiring manager or the company that you're trying to move to. So learning how to kind of frame my experience in compelling ways that spoke to them, because they're not coming to look for you if you're different. And so
it should be, but they aren't.
Yeah. And I'll say the kind of these points of challenge or pride. Or before that, let me say also that I think we always need perspective from other people. When I talk to some of my friends or people meet me for the first time, they believe I took a lot of risk in my career. In fact, I'm actually the opposite. I am very risk averse. And so most of the moves I did were through some planning. There is that luck and serendipity to your point there. But I tried to de-risk things to the ways possible. So points of challenge. I did have periods where the door would get slammed on me a lot, or maybe not like that, or it just wouldn't even be opened. So periods when I was in Silicon Valley, when I first moved there from China, that experience people didn't recognize. No one was picking up my resume or calling me. And that was also tough because I was at Stanford. It was like a great job market. So that was a very kind of humbling experience to kind of move through that. But the points of pride was having gone through many of these pivots, and I would say this is probably a common theme in many people that you work with, is that the more you do the pivots or reinvention, the better you get at it.
And the less risky it feels, right? So while you talk about having de-risked it along the way, I'm betting that your perception of the level of risk also shifted a great deal as you became more accomplished in making these kinds of transitions.
Exactly. And so going through those pivots and reinventing, there were great accomplishments along the way that I feel very proud of setting up the first private hospital in China, taking Invisalign, invisible dental braces around the globe, and then impacting lots of people through my coaching and speaking now. And that just gave a lot of confidence. This is the other part of doing it many times. You then build that confidence that you can do this in different contexts, and you start to see the pieces that move the needle. And again, people aren't necessarily looking for you, so you need to have them see you or recognize or kind of get in front of them. And there's persistence and learning through it. So those would be some of the points of pride, and glad to share that here.
Wonderful. I also loved the point you made about not necessarily doing the thing that was obviously the thing that you were good at. You were in search of other adjacencies, as you called them. That would suggest that you learned how to say no earlier than many.
I think that's a tough thing. And again, I think every person has to kind of decide for themselves. Some people do want to stay in one career for a variety of reasons or be doing one thing. But this part around, I call it strategic quitting, or when to say no, it was tough to walk away from some of the achievements, because you also get a lot of ego that's fed into that. We have a lot of our identities wrapped up in our job or our title. And then to leave that, particularly if you're going to a place that where that doesn't count, new industry, new country or whatever, it can be humbling. It can be a very humbling experience. So I think that's part of it, is kind of your own inner compass and what drives you. But yeah, it's learning to say no, because we sometimes often gravitate to what is comfortable.
Absolutely. So you've already shared several pearls of wisdom that you've drawn from this path that you've been on. But if I challenged you to summarize the top 3 lessons that you've learned in your career journey, what would you tell me, and what sort of leadership commonalities do you see across those?
The top things in my career journey, I would say the importance, I hate to use the word, of networking, of kind of building a set of people who are advisors or helping you explore new areas. The networking piece of your career journey. The second piece is the interpersonal skills. And then the third is that muscle around persistence and resilience. I would say those are the key pieces of the career journey. And your other question, again, I was focused on that one.
Isn't it dreadful how we get into a tunnel? The other question was about the sort of commonalities of leadership competencies that you see across those lessons.
From having worked in so many diverse places, certainly there are nuances and way things are done differently by country or industry, but I would say we have much more in common, right, as a human race or as an organizations than we have that's different. And if I were to boil down a couple of the pieces, one is this about building rapport and trust. That, particularly if you're kind of trying to do something over the long term, right? We can talk about short term, faking trust, et cetera. But if you want that to build a cohesive team, to build something over time, getting to trust is fundamental. And there's some principles of how you do that, but that trust piece. And it goes back to what I said before, this part around the interpersonal of making relationships work, even with people who you may not see eye to eye with, to get things done. Because ultimately leadership is about getting things done, right? Being effective. And so that interpersonal has many dimensions, like understand what motivates people, understand how to sway them or to compromise when you need to get to the bigger picture. So I'd say those are the couple of the top ones.
Brilliant. Thank you. Now, obviously, one could divide your career up into all kinds of different segments along different sets of criteria, but one of the biggest transitions you've made in many respects is that from being a corporate employee to being a portfolio career consultant and advisor. We love this kind of massive disruptive change. It's what gets us out of bed every morning. But of course, it's a challenge. Why don't you take us through the decision-making and the process and the pains and the gains of that particular transition?
Yeah, so this transition and this part around so much of our identity is wrapped up because I shifted from, I was running China for a large American multinational. And so, yes, great perks, whole team reported to me, et cetera. So there's a lot of ego wrapped up in that. And I essentially had done some of the things that I wanted to achieve in that role, career-wise. And this was kind of going back to the things that mattered. And I always knew that I loved working and developing people. When you get to that level in an organization, a lot of what you do is manage politics, manage corporate expectations, and hit the numbers, right? Very American public sales mentality. So the amount of things I could do developing people felt less, right? Even directly, I enjoyed that. So when there was kind of a ability to make some of those transitions, I looked at it. And I would say some of the process here is one is doing experiments beforehand, right? Doing a guest lecture somewhere, mentoring some people on the side. So because often we think we want to do these things, and then we believe you got to cut cold turkey and then go do it. And then you do it and you're like, holy smokes, I don't like this, or I wanted the income, right? And so the idea of kind of doing some experiments, if you can do that, helped me. I probably could have done more of it, right? And I advise people to do more of that. But that transition, which was about 6 years ago when I shifted into coaching, was actually probably not as disruptive or difficult, partly because I had developed this muscle that we talked about before of transitions. And I had, by that point, started to develop network. I'm very good at keeping in touch with people. But, and here's the key difference from when I was younger, was I actually started to use my network. It's right, one thing to have it, and use sounds like a very manipulative term, but is to tap into it. And I realized when I started to reach out to people, they remembered me because I kept in touch, or I had helped them in the past without asking for anything. And so there was that reciprocity and that relationship. People would respond to things and be of help, to the extent possible. So that helped enable the transition. And I wouldn't say it was this, left corporate and then suddenly became a coach. There's that messy period in there where literally for the first year or two, I was like, I love the teaching. I was doing 4 things at once. I was teaching MBAs here at IE Business School. I was consulting because I still had, in medical devices, a large footprint. Training around the world, kind of sales training, and coaching, more or less at the same time. And so that was to figure out what I liked, what I didn't like, and then when to kind of quit or lower some of these, and how coaching fulfills most of the things that I want. And then you kind of figure out how that all fits together. So that was the process. And again, it may look like risk, but when we kind of just talked through it there, and now that I'm talking through it with you, there was this kind of process that actually is kind of the repeat of that general process I used when I had shifted in other places before.
There's nothing like a successful formula, even if we don't recognize it at the time, right?
Yeah.
So let's think about the sort of advice that you might pass on to people starting their careers now. You've learned personally, professionally. You've also learned from your clients, who are typically executives hoping to explode their way through glass ceilings, whether those are imagined or real, in their rise to the top. What would you want to be telling early career professionals who are looking to accelerate and do great things?
Early on, we're often very focused on our work, the doing, partly because we enter as individual contributors. And I am a huge believer in hard work and doing things, but not to neglect this huge people part. Again, the building that network, We can talk about how sponsorship or mentorship is really critical if you want to kind of continue to progress in your organization. So to be focusing on that, and again, each person kind of determines their path, but a lot of people, I'd say, early on, if you can, get responsibility for managing other people, because that seems easy, and you'll always probably criticize your boss, but until you actually do it, you realize how hard that is. And that is a skill that you're going to need, because as you move up, it's about influence. You don't always have the I will tell you and you will do. So that, I think, is the key one. The second, and this particularly now in the economy, people tend to, because they are risk averse, they will tend to stay in their positions too long, or they will see all this risk if they do other things. And when you stay, you can become siloed or very much missing certain things. So to integrate as part of your job, not necessarily an add-on, of, hey, this ability to kind of see outside. You can build these things into your job by roles you take, by things you do. It doesn't always have to be a side hustle or an add-on to your 60-hour week. But I think if you do those two things, you start to position yourself really well for wherever it is you want to go.
Brilliant. That's wonderful. Now, let's talk about your book, Get Promoted. Tell us about your motivation to write it and what sort of needs you're trying to address with the book. And I'd love to know a little bit about the process for writing, because obviously we've been through that painful experience too. Fun as well, but give us a picture.
Why'd I write it is I'm imagining the exact same reason you guys wrote yours, which is I wanted to help more people. As an executive coach, one-on-one kind of hits this cap in terms of scale or how many people you can reach. So to share the ideas, if you feel like you've got something that's going to help people, get that out there. So I wanted to help more people. And then second, I love to write. It was kind of my first area, kind of journalism that I went into. And it is my way. I think we all have ways of processing. I'm a big fan of kind of structured reflection, but it's a way to kind of process and put things in order in my own head so that can I explain those to others? And if you can connect others to a great idea or to something, that to me is very meaningful. So those were the two big ones, but I'd say the third, and why this book, as some of my friends said, I wouldn't have imagined you would have written this type of book, was that I felt like I wanted to correct some misnomers that I saw in the leadership industry. I think there's a lot of good stuff out there, but I think like there's a lot of just feel good things that people will say that really doesn't have much connection to how things actually operate or the evidence. And we could talk more about that. But that then goes into the specifics of what I was trying to address. And I talk about it in my introduction. I saw many great people, talented, hardworking, the people we want as leaders, get stalled, get overlooked, get frustrated, and so that, or even derailed. And the ones who were rising, and then all the evidence when I looked at the support of this, were this set of people who, for better or for worse, we attach these negative connotations. Oh, they're super political, they're power hungry, narcissists, and we get a lot of those people, and they run a lot of companies and countries into the ground. So that really frustrated me, and I said, how can we help those great people who are stalled learn some of these things that actually do propel you or get you to positions of influence or increase your impact without actually becoming those people? And as a coach, helping people work through that process, it's one thing to kind of understand how that is, but then how do you actually implement it, particularly if it's, that seems to clash against my values or what I do. That's what I was trying to address in the book, a kind of framework for looking at that. Finally, the third question about the process. I started small. I just started to write articles, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, blog pieces. And as I kind of saw what was resonating, what was hitting the mark, then it was actually the book became easier, but it was a painful process for me because I would write parts, rewrite it. And eventually, I wanted to get it out there, but I also had this feedback loop where I had a lot of people look at it, and that was useful as well. That was the process. Longer than I wanted.
I don't know anyone who's written a book more quickly and more painlessly than they expected or wanted. Okay, so let's talk about what's in the book. There's a number of incredible stories and multiple pieces of advice and guidance, notably around building power, navigating politics, and managing key stakeholders. However, if you were to boil down the main ideas of the book, what would these be?
Two main ideas. The first is if you understand power, and you know how to build it or exercise it, you can actually get a lot done much faster than you think. So it's this central idea around power. And the second main point of the book is that much of what holds us back is ourselves. And often we need to learn new behaviors or skills to help us grow. And that can often be hard if we've got this very rigid sense of, this is who I am and this is what I do. So if you can work through that process and think of it maybe as experiments, that can really propel you. But it's kind of looking inward. We always believe we're above average. We believe others are not as good. So if you kind of take that honest look and say, what could I do? And how can I channel that and learn new things? That is also a piece that propels people. So those are the two main, I would say, from the book.
Fantastic. I mean, in so many respects, common sense, but clearly not, and definitely very powerful. Now, talking of power, you have this 3-part power framework that you explain and use in the book and encourage all of us to use in our lives as we go forward. The 3 parts that you include are the rock, the map, and the snowball, which are incredibly evocative names. For our listeners who are looking for help in their own careers, can you elaborate on this 3-part formula and perhaps share some concrete examples and practical tips to apply it?
I laid out the book in this fashion to kind of help people through it. And the rock, the map, and the snowball, if you think about like rock, paper, scissors, this is where the genesis came. I used to do a lot of innovation and I was a marketer, but I was thinking about this game and then I started to Google it. And you think about this game as random, right? We're just kind of playing. But actually now with AI, when they analyze people, there's patterns. And if you can understand patterns, you can actually improve, right? Do better. This is rely on the evidence and think about things. So that's a little bit of where the genesis is. First time I've kind of shared that of where that came from. But the rock, the map, and the snowball is very simple. The rock is about getting real. The map is about getting strategic. And the snowball is about getting doing. And to go in this and to add an example here. So the rock, getting real, a lot of this evidence that we show why certain people rise, like political behaviors, power being this force, is things that, like Gloria Steinem said, the truth's first is really gonna piss you off. It will set you free, but first is gonna piss you off. So understanding some of that. And then the map around getting strategic is, a lot of people have these visions of where they want to go, this idea of kind of true north. But unless you really kind of look at the landscape and you realize, okay, this is the chessboard and how the pieces are how I need to move, you just don't hop from point A to point B. Sometimes it's like some intermediary parts and thinking about the best path. So that's getting strategic. And then the third is the snowball, so get doing. Basic physics, right? Nothing happens unless something moves. You could sit here and forever think about things, but unless you actually go do it, things don't happen. So I'll apply that to an example. Let's go back to networking. I think sometimes it gets overspoken, or it's like, oh, I've got to go out to mixers and so forth. I don't like to do that. I'm an introvert, et cetera, et cetera. Just walk through the framework. So the rock piece, and I talk a lot about this in that first part of the book, we can lay out the evidence, right? Networking propels your careers. There's been longitudinal studies that look at this. Sponsorship, you just can look around your organization. These people get the plum assignments. They get the stretch roles. They're being talked about in the room during succession planning. So the evidence there is overwhelming. And one, I think you need to recognize that. And that might feel like, like that person doesn't have the smarts or skills I do, but they have this piece that really shows they move. Looking at that and saying, hey, if I were to do these things, the odds are that they're going to help me. Okay. But here's the part where seeing it on one level doesn't move me. And that's where you move into the map and the snowball. And the map, let's be very practical about this. And I would encourage everyone out there to think about this, is map out your organization or kind of this larger arena. Let's say you're also thinking about a career shift. Well, who in the organization do you need to know, would be able to, if they were to say something or introduce someone, actually move the needle? Okay, they can be anywhere in the organization, but oftentimes they're near the top. They have power. They have a large network themselves. They're connectors. And look at how you spend your time, right? Most people are spending their time down. They don't want to do the networking for a variety of reasons. So it's kind of taking a hard look at yourself and to say, okay, list 5 people who might move the needle for you. And then the snowball is, okay, we mapped them out, but you need to, and I'll use the word here kind of loosely, but engineer a way to make that relationship happen. How can you build that? One is a direct way is you could seek them out, right? Ask their advice. People are much more willing to help us than we think. And if they say no, well, then you got at least some data point versus thinking about this. You can be creative, and I talk about this in the book. You can take on projects that are meaningful, that would give you exposure to them, that help them with their agendas. Or you can also think in these experiments of some things you could bring into the company. Like I see people bring in speaker series that they kind of add value to the organization, expose you and build relationships with people outside. This idea of don't just become siloed in your organization. So I think that's an example, and there's many here, and a framework should apply to many things, applying that rock map and snowball. And of course, it's not necessarily linear. You're jumping back to look at the evidence too of, well, what does get people to say yes to us or want to meet with us, spend half an hour, right, of their busy day to talk with us.
Absolutely. It's a very simple model, not necessarily easy to implement at every stage, but fascinatingly simple. It sounds as though a lot of what you've been alluding to now is something that you covered in a piece that you wrote recently in Harvard Business Review called How to Network with Powerful People. And one of the key recommendations in that was how important it is to come recommended. Now, you've obviously talked just now about many aspects of that, but is there any additional gem that you could share on this notion of coming recommended?
We as coaches, a lot of what we're doing is unlocking things that people actually know, but they're not doing. So in that article, and it's an exercise I do, and I think people can do for themselves, is to flip this around. So let's say we have a mid-tier executive, and they're like, how am I going to go reach out to a CEO or someone in the C-suite? And you ask them, well, like 10 people who are just out of college all reach out to you. They want half an hour of your time. And what would cause you, or of your busy schedule, to say yes to one of them? And they think, well, if they were alumni from the same place as me, or they look like they're really smart and it could help me with my job, or like my boss said, I should meet them, right? So this is the come recommended piece. And so things like this could be a recommendation from someone. It could be also because you've got, and the social science would show this, right? There's something that also is a signal, like a market signal. You were at such and such a school. You gave such a talk at, this top place. You were featured, right? You're 30 under 30, okay? There's different things, right, that would signal to this person, this is a rising person, someone that would be important to know, or someone I trust. That point of trust is recommending them. And the gem in here, I would say, is because building that network and so forth is challenging. We have to spend time doing it and be thoughtful and strategic about it. But the number one thing people can do when they do, so let's say, so Claire, I finally get the introduction to you. You're in the C-suite and I want to talk to you. At the end of that conversation, you've got to read the conversation, is to say, thank you so much for your time. It's been really valuable. And as we were talking about that, this area is super interesting to me. Who else should I talk to that would have some insights on that you know? And then suddenly Claire is thinking about, okay, this is an easy one. I can help this. I think about 2 or 3 people. And then I say, could you make an introduction to them? And so doing your one thing, suddenly, boom, you've got like 4 other people and you've come recommended. So when you reach out, it's not this awkward cold call, or heaven forbid, you say, I want to pick your brain, right? That's the one that's not even going to get answered. Claire had sent this note. I talked to her. She said that you have these real interesting insights on this area. Do you have 10, 15 minutes to talk about that? As an example. So here's where I think the come recommended is very powerful.
Absolutely. It's crucial and often ignored or undervalued. So thank you for advancing that. Now let's switch right back to something else. If you could go and talk to your 18-year-old self, what sort of advice would you be wanting to give to the poor young lad of the time?
Well, it's interesting. Like, I'm kind of going through this as my son quickly approaches that age, and I see parts of him in me. And I'm not sure if I went and talked to my 18-year-old self, the 18-year-old self would have listened. And so I'd have to think about.
So number one advice might have been listen.
Yeah. And thinking about how you package things, how you frame things. So, part of it, the advice I would give to that 18-year-old self is that people part, and to think deeply and get exposure to interacting with other people, communicating, honing kind of these skills around persuasion, the interpersonal skills, which could be activities you could do, could be like jobs you take, et cetera, like go be a waiter for a while, right? Or go, those types of things. That's what I would tell my 18-year-old self, but I'd have to think, and I don't have an answer right here, of like how I'd have to package that up so it would get through to me.
Oh, yeah. That's the crucial part of the formula, very definitely. But we won't put you on the spot on that.
Yeah, no, it's that one video, and I think about this a lot. Randy Pausch at Carnegie Mellon, he had this famous last lecture, and he talks about the head fake, right? How so you're kind of presenting something, but you're actually sending another deeper lesson there. So I'll give that some more thought as to how I would do that.
We'll come back to that. Now, another fantasy question. If you had a magic wand and could change one thing about the world of work, what would it be?
Oh, that one is very straightforward, is that we had more thoughtful leaders.
Oh, yeah. Hallelujah.
We get a lot of narcissists that run places into the ground. It's all about them. And I wish there were the magic wand, to your question. But I think, we are doing that one person at a time. And that's why I've kind of set that as my mission, because I see a lot of those great people get stalled and not get there. And so if we get more of those people into power or just impact, right? You don't have to have the title to have influence or power. But if we can get more of those thoughtful people, we're going to get much better organizations, society, the way countries are run.
Wonderful. And as a corollary to that, thinking about great organizations, we always are on the lookout for the companies that are doing the very best job possible in both talent and career management. There's a debate about whether companies should be doing career management or whether we should all be individually responsible. Our take is that it takes two to tango. But tell us about any great examples you have of companies doing very well in these respects.
Boy, you're more the expert on this. So to be fair, I see much more dysfunctional organizations than great examples. I'm sorry to say that. And so I really don't have that many. I'll say a couple things. Some of them tend to be smaller companies. I think you have this issue when they get bigger. And some of those I can't necessarily talk about. But I think Google has gotten very big, and it might be an overused example. But I think they have some very good things that they do that manage some of the biases, the worst biases that can occur, people rising. So it's harder to, quote, game the system there of doing things. But I think they're also, size is hard to manage. Yeah. And I would say, not necessarily companies that come to mind, but I can see individuals. And again, this is when they arise to leadership positions, how they, by the power of their influence and the things that they can do, they start to create better organizations. Again, I do a lot of these closed door, so I can't talk about the one I just had this morning, but she does this amazing job of getting more of the voices in the room heard, the way meetings are run, the way opportunities are presented. And so I think those are things that help propel people's careers and is an example of more what we want in organizations.
Beautiful. Thank you. So just to close, what are your most exciting projects on the table or under wraps for the rest of the year and maybe even early next year?
So it was funny because I was talking to a couple of friends who were authors, and they said, well, a book launch, don't think of it as like a week or a month. Think of it as 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's really valid advice.
Yeah. So I'm so excited that we're, knock on wood, coming out of COVID. And so there's going to be time to travel and be back in person with people. But I would say my big project, and I'm going to kind of stick with this one, 3 years feels like a long time, but getting the word out about my book. I'm just deeply committed to it after I did work through it. I'm very happy is not the right word, but I want that message to get to people. So I'm behind it. And then opportunities like this to be on your podcast to talk about it have been great. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on here. I know I say this at the end of most of the podcasts, but it's truly meant this time. We could probably go on for hours and hours, but podcast audiences have a certain threshold of tolerance. And I suspect we've got there time-wise. I learned such a lot from you. Thank you so much for being a willing and exciting guest for us today.
And thank you for inviting me, Claire, and also for the book that you've written, helping people make those career transitions, because it's not always easy or necessarily intuitive. So thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.